And share screen. Okay. Was anyone not here last week? Ethan, were you here last week? I can't remember.
William left really early last week.
I see, but you were here the whole time, right?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, could you get your flow paper out from last week?
Yes.
So, if you have those, then I remember we left off and we finished second cross, so now we're going to summary. And there's just summary and final focus speech left. So as a kind of quick review, right? AF's case was kind of like, NAFTA was overall good for Mexico because that means that like Chinese hegemony wouldn't like ruin the whole entire world, and also that Mexico came out of its peso recession because it had more exports, investor confidence, and a US bailout. And then what Neg said in response to that was that Chinese hegemony, like, it's not going to happen anyway, so their first contention doesn't matter. And then in response to their contention too, they said with or without NAFTA, Mexico would still have the same amount of trade, and the U.S. would have still prevented Mexico from going into a recession because they didn't want it to spill over into a global recession, which is obviously bad for everyone. And then they said NAFTA is the root cause of Mexico's recession. And then next case was NAFTA was bad because it stopped Mexico from developing, and it like made the recession really bad. So basically they were saying like, oh, Mexico had like slowly liberalized its economy, but then NAFTA came in and was like, we're just gonna like take off all restrictions on companies, and companies can do whatever they want. And that obviously screwed over the Mexico economy because it destroyed the domestic industry, since now big companies like, I don't even know, like Toyota maybe replaced some small Mexican, car company. So lots of jobs were lost. And then it also made Mexico super financially dependent on the US. So every time the US had a recession, Mexico had one as well. And after responses to this was that, like originally Mexico needed NAFTA because its economy was already starting to slow because liberalization wasn't like really working anymore. And then they talked about how like NAFTA actually decreased volatility of the economy by 40%, which is really good because like without NAFTA, like it would have been really bad for Mexico because Mexico wouldn't have any money to keep developing, and it wouldn't have gotten out of its recession. Right, so let's continue. Let me know if you can't hear anything, but I think you should be able to. Yeah, they're just taking prep time.
I don't hear anything.
Yeah, they're just taking prep, that's why.
Starts on their contention 2, moves to our case. All right.
So this is the neg speaking. No, it should be the yeah, it's the neg speaking for summary. So they're gonna first respond to AF's contention 2 and then their own case.
The first key extension on their contention 2 comes from Harvard, telling you that we have the same amount of trade in either world. The two differences are, one, we have it through gradual pace. The second difference is that we maintain regulations or to protect domestic industries. Regulations go all out on day one in a pro world. I'll implicate that later. The second thing to extend comes to the University of Houston. This is really important because it tells us that Mexico was the #1 model for development pre-NAFTA in 1993. Now, this is important because that means that influxes in investor capital would have been able to continue and future government governmental generations. The third is the CPS term, telling you that in reality, because of NAFTA, the change in investment was to FPI, foreign portfolio investment, which are things like stocks, which are way more volatile. But a key concession we get is that the only reason a global crisis was even possible was because of NAFTA happening in the first place. We argue that that risk is not good because of the clean extension of the Neely card, that Mexico would have been able to stabilize its economy if the NAFTA dependence was not created. She just says that political violence was also a factor, but Devesh takes this into account, and our card is very specific in saying that NAFTA compromised 50% of the devaluation, taking this into account. More specifically, on our case, a couple of things. The first thing that she says is that we didn't have sustainable momentums, we would have caused a global crisis. The HBR card is very specific here because of things like she says, like signing on to other free trade agreements, like in 1988, the GATT, we were already contractually locked, not we, Mexico was contractually locked into reforms that would have continued. Then she says, that we have renegotiations happening right now. One, she doesn't prove poverty probability, but second, the damage is already done. We already have 5 million or tens of millions of people displaced. On our point about protecting domestic industry, she says that NAFTA put stipulations that we could grow, but because we became dependent on these foreign investors, we could not rely on these stipulations, and they were forced to ignore them. Then she says prices went down because of our warrant. But our point is that short-term prices went down, but the World Trade Organization specifically tells you when accounting for monopolization long-term in 97% of the agricultural market, prices went up by 38%. The impact is that poverty was reduced by 1/3 in other Latin American countries that use this same type of development path. But Mexico had nothing. They pushed tens of millions of people into poverty per recession just because of foreign dependence. And it's for these reasons that I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Okay, do you have like any questions about what he said in that speech?
Well, he said a lot less than the other things.
Definitely, because it's only
I didn't hear a lot, so like I only wrote like a few things down.
yeah, that's okay. Because summary speeches used to be 2 minutes, so you really had to condense. Now they're 3 minutes, which is completely better, but it also makes like the round a lot harder. So basically what he said was he extended his responses on their second contention, right? He extended the Harvard card saying that, some amount of trade was like, they would have still had the same amount of trade absent NAFTA, so they could have come out of this recession themselves. But the problem was that like NAFTA just like allowed all the trade in at once without any restrictions, whereas before it was like slowly liberalizing. And then he extends the Houston card, which there was enough like FDI, foreign direct investment, in order to come out of this recession because Mexico had like a good economy, so people wanted to invest. But NAFTA made it worse because they just like encourage people to invest in like stocks, which is more volatile than like investing in like real, like good industry development. And then at the bottom, he extends this Neely 17 card that says, like without NAFTA, this peso recession wouldn't even have been that bad. And NAFTA caused like 50% of the devaluation of the peso because of like reliance on like this NAFTA trade agreement. So basically, he's saying that without NAFTA, this recession wouldn't even have been like really bad at all. And then on his case, he basically extends the fact that NAFTA destroys domestic industry, and he talks about how it made Mexico dependent on foreign investors. And because of this, it like every single recession that it went through, millions more people fell into poverty. So while the rest of Latin America was doing like amazing, they were all coming out of poverty, like a third of their people out of poverty. Mexico instead, because it was in this like relationship with NAFTA, it like millions of people fell into poverty every single recession that happened. So because it relied, on NAFTA, and like when the US went down, it went down even harder. All right. So now it's going to be the AF summary. Showing cards. Okay, we should be. Yeah, here we go.
So for the judges, it's going to start off on their first contention. Everyone ready? Yes. Let's start off with their first contention. Remember the second response from Orme, which says that the GDP growth that they talk about, which was so good, would be difficult to sustain without NAFTA because they needed NAFTA to actually engage in the international market and to become integrated internationally. That's going to be important later. But then on their evidence about destroying of domestic industries, we say from Letterman that NAFTA included provisions to protect the agricultural industry, which is the only industry they talk about. Don't let them talk about more industries in Final Focus. Then they say that it was dependent and that the dependency was the only reason why they were able to allow for the agricultural industry to be destroyed. But this doesn't make sense because they say they want a gradual approach. Letterman says that NAFTA included provisions to protect the agricultural industry and gradually reduce tariffs. That means that it is not the fault of U.S. participation in NAFTA that destroyed these industries, it's rather the fault of Mexican participation in NAFTA that destroyed these industries because they did it all on their own. Now let's go into our second contention about incentivizing a U.S. bailout. The main response here that they extend comes from Neely, which explains that the reason that they started the bailout and the peso crisis was because of U.S. dependency, and that they would have been able to recover from it on their own. Their evidence does not say that Mexico was able to recover from the peso crisis, and clearly this isn't the case, because the Puig evidence at the bottom of our case says that Argentina had a similar peso crisis, but did not have the close economic linkages forged to the United States because of NAFTA. And when they had that peso crisis and they didn't have the U.S. to bail them out with billions of dollars, their poverty rate doubled. They don't actually give you a quantified impact about how much poverty would have decreased through their gradual approach, or what even their gradual approach would have even meant, because we say that NAFTA included those provisions for that gradual approach. But we say from the Humphrey evidence that the devaluation of the peso that started in 1988, years before NAFTA talks even began, that hurt NAFTA, and the Clinton had to act. And that and the Lacuna evidence, which explains that the U.S. had no choice but to bail out Mexico or suffer the economic chaos itself. They only impact to the Mexican development being slowed. But we say from the Vasquez evidence that the U.S. bailout prevented the impact of a global financial crisis that would have impacted a lot more countries in Mexico. That means we outweigh on scope.
All right. Any questions on this summary?
No.
All right. Okay. And then now is Grand Cross.
Sorry. Okay, so you talk about how there would have been a global crisis, right? So my question is, did the 2008 global recession wipe out all of the improvements in living standards that we saw for developing countries both beforehand and after?
There wasn't evidence read in the round about that.
I'm just asking you, from a historical
the
perspective.
2008 recession was bad, right? But we say in the evidence and response that doesn't get responded to, which Eden brings up in the rebuttal, says that because Mexico had free trade agreements with so many other countries, they still would have probably been hit as hard, if not harder, without NAFTA.
Yeah, but
right?
those agreements were all signed after NAFTA.
And we asked
my
a question.
question wasn't
Also, that
answered,
was
though.
responded to.
It's
They were
Grand
able to maintain
Crossfire.
regulations.
Wait.
It's Grand Cross, and there was no argument made in the round
okay,
that
this is not a new
NAFTA was
argument.
the reason for those other free trade agreements. And I would also add that a lot of those free trade agreements were predated NAFTA. So it is the case that Mexico still would have had a lot of linkages to other countries throughout the world.
To clarify,
even if NAFTA did
we're not trying to make a new response. All
Okay.
we're asking you is that when we compare the impact of 25 years of development versus one recession that could have been
Okay.
really bad, we would argue that those recessions, we still recover from them, and the development in the long term still benefits the world.
Let's talk about the recovery process. So Argentina, is its growth higher than Mexico's or lower than Mexico's?
Higher by a factor of 2.
No, it is not.
Yeah, it is as of this year, yeah.
No, okay. Well, as of 2017, it's lower, right?
It's
and
not- it's
over
not lower.
1994 to 2017, its per capita GDP growth per year has actually less than Mexico's, right? So
No,
that's the comparative,
wait,
right?
to clarify-
Argentina had a peso crisis without a U.S. bailout. Their poverty rate more than doubled, and their growth slowed more than Mexico's. But we have a question.
Well, I mean, you just said a lot of things. I wanted to respond.
Okay,
what I would say
respond and then I'll
is that
question.
actually those numbers about low growth were only in the years after Argentina's recession. On their broad trend,
Clearly.
not only has their growth been higher, but even if we neglect growth, their poverty reduction has been several times higher than Mexico's.
No,
so even
Argentina
in your worst case
specifically is
example,
not no.
it
Argentina's
doubled in the
poverty
first couple
rate
of years
is not
after
decreasing.
NAFTA.
We read you the evidence that Mexico went from the #1 developing model to post-NAFTA 18th out of 20.
Right, and our argument explains why that happens, because we say that
Because of one
it
peso
experienced the
crisis?
peso crisis, that's why they had lower
Really?
development than the rest of Latin America.
So-
But we would
Does that
say
make a lot
that the
of
peso
sense?
crisis without the bailout would have been a lot worse and would have caused even lower rates of poverty reduction and even lower rates of growth. And number two, that same impact would have been seen across Latin America had the U.S. bailout not occurred.
Other
which our
Latin
evidence
American
specifically
countries
says
were
happened
hit by
because of
recession.
Can we
NAFTA.
have a
Correct.
question? Can we have a
Like,
question?
you guys can
about,
have a
your
question.
narrative, right? So how much slower would have the Mexican economy liberalized without NAFTA?
Right. So what we tell you is that while the tariffs were going away gradually under NAFTA, all of the protections for investment and all of the regulations were wiped out overnight.
Wait,
so we would
what
argue that
industries,
none of
though?
that would have happened.
The only industry that you talk about is the agricultural industry.
That's our
It's not
example, but we
responsive to
tell
the
you
evidence
that's on
which
the
explains
whole
that they
regulation.
had provisions in the agricultural
Yeah,
industry
those are
to
tariffs.
crowd out multinational
Right.
corporations,
Again,
but the
Chris-
Mexican government
Yeah.
did not follow these provisions.
As
So
I
it's
said,
not US
those are
participation
tariffs,
in
those
NAFTA.
are not regulations, and we point out that the only reason they went away was because American hedge funds threatened them and put pressure under NAFTA.
Any questions about the Grand Cross?
No.
All right. This is a first neg.
Hello? Are you guys good now?
Why did everyone
Yeah.
laugh?
Okay. Cool. We made it. All right. This is my last speech ever, so let's do it. Time starts. Beginning with the issue of recessions, what we tell you is a couple of things. First, both of us agree that trade would have been the same with or without NAFTA. They themselves talk about other agreements that were signed, so it doesn't make a lot of sense when they say that NAFTA locked in the increase in trade. Ishan told you in 1988, Mexico signed onto the GATT, which was a binding agreement that would have made them increase trade in either world. The difference was, first, you got rid of the protections for the domestic industries. It happened a lot faster. But second, you got rid of regulation under NAFTA, which is going to be the crucial reason why you sign your ballot for the con. Let's deal with the specific impact they talk about. They tell you that when you have an American bailout and more investment, they recover from 94. We tell you that, first of all, by 1993, they were already leading Latin America, so they did not need this American investment. And more importantly, the type of investment changed to being 5 times more volatile under NAFTA. So on the whole, the odds of a recession increased. We tell you that the reason this recession happened was, first, by becoming dependent on American investment. Under NAFTA, when America pulled out, the peso fell an additional 50%. But second, they say that Mexico could not have recovered on their own, and we agree. What our evidence tells you is that without NAFTA, Mexico could have stopped it before it even started, but under NAFTA, they had no ability to do so. They are solving a problem that they only created. At the end of the day, even if you buy that Argentina and other countries have hit recessions, we say 2 things. 1, America has bailed out Mexico even before free trade agreements, so you don't need NAFTA. But 2, the rest of Latin America have all seen similar recessions, and all of them, despite global financial crises alike, have bounced back. They've been hit less hard, and they have reduced poverty by 1/3 while growing twice as fast. We show that a recession is not the end-all be-all. Finally, on our case, the only 2 things they say is that we locked in increasing free trade, and we respond to this by showing you that it was already locked in. They tell you that they had the ability to protect their corn industry, and even if that's true, regulations on the whole still went away, which is why, on balance, it was a net job destroyer. On balance, every recession hit Mexico harder than the rest of Latin America, and on balance, every Latin American country cut poverty by 1/3, while Mexico made no progress whatsoever. On balance, you're voting con. Yeah.
All right. Any questions?
Well, the last part when he was like listing the 4 things was kind of confusing, but not really.
I think he's just trying to like make it like a rhetorical appeal, because
When everyone's ready. Weisberg explains that all the growth that they talk about happened during protectionism. But second of all, Orme explains that without NAFTA, the growth that they talk about would not have been sustainable. They say that Mexico was already involved in the gap, but they dropped the warrant behind the Orme evidence, which they never interact with throughout the round. He explains that the party that was in power faced serious opposition during that election. The election that year was threatened to undo all of the progress on liberalization. That's why they needed new momentum. They needed NAFTA to be signed to sustain the growth that was seen. You would not have seen the increase in GDP and the growth they talk talked about absent NAFTA. Don't let them wiggle around and go for the general idea of their contention. The only regulation that they talked about in case and throughout the round is on agriculture. That's why the Lederman evidence is the round-losing piece of evidence for them. They ignore the fact that the tariffs were possible under NAFTA, specifically on the agricultural industry, but Mexico chose not to use them. This means that U.S. participation is not the reason why all of their impacts are occurring. It's the Mexican government's failure to properly implement NAFTA positions that they were offered, which means that it's not the case that the affirmative is actually the reason for these impacts. It's not because of American participation. It's specifically because of the Mexican government, and NAFTA included provisions that could have prevented this from happening. But moreover, they say on recessions, we tell you that Mexico has free trade agreements with 46 other countries, so they would have seen recessionary impacts even without NAFTA. The place where you vote for us is off of the bailout. They tell you that recession creates dependency, but it's not that they could recover on their own. Their evidence doesn't say that. In Argentina, without the bailout, the poverty doubled. They say that poverty was reduced in other Latin American countries, not in the ones that had a peso crisis without a bailout, like Argentina, where poverty doubled. But second, Humphrey explains that devaluation happened years before talks began. It was not because of NAFTA, but Lacuna specifically finds that the U.S. had no choice but to bail out Mexico, specifically because of the linkages caused by NAFTA. We outweigh on strength of link because all of their arguments are reliant upon Mexican government's failure to properly implement NAFTA, but the peso crisis was caused by NAFTA. The previous bailouts were not because of the United States, but they experienced massive capital flight, specifically because of the depreciation that was already on trend from happening. As per the Blecker evidence, the evidence that we read specifically isolates for NAFTA as the reason why we saw the bailout and the reasons why Mexico didn't see an increase in poverty.
Wow. Right. Might have been kind of confusing. Okay. Who won? I don't know. Who do you think won? I'll search up the results. But why don't you make a guess?
The right person.
The right side? You think they won? The neg won? Let me think. Who do I think? This is hard. Here, I'll just go with the left, okay? And we'll see. This is 2018 Nationals. Drum roll. AF won. So the left side did win.
Cool.
Let's talk about the round. So, let me grab my charger first.
Hello?
Sorry, Ethan. Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yeah, my computer just died, but I plugged it in, so we're okay now. So, overall, I'd say this is, obviously a really good round because it's nationals. So I just want to go over some of the speeches and explain, how they apply with the things that we learned about. So, let me see. Okay, so first on case, right? So I wonder if there's a way to show my flow. Maybe if I take a picture. No, it's too ugly. Okay, anyways, so on their case, when we're looking at the AF case, they talk about like they have different contentions, right? Their contention one was basically like the future, like in the future, NAFTA will prevent a Chinese hegemony, right? So we have the where are we? Oh, right. We have the link, which is if there was not NAFTA, then China would have filled in, you know, replacing the US's spot in Latin America. And then the impact, and then like the link, the internal link to that. So basically, like there's a link and then a separate link, which is, so the first link is that no NAFTA means Chinese economic fill-in. And then a Chinese economic fill-in means increased like Chinese influence in Latin America, right? And then the impact of that is basically like China has bad human rights. So if China becomes, you know, the hegemon leader there, then there would have been bad human rights in that area. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to find. Honestly, okay, yeah. So, you know, when we're writing a contention, we want to have, you know, the link and the impact and the implication, right? So the implication was that it curtails individual freedom. Now, I think the second contention is probably a better example of this, right? So first, the uniqueness is that, so basically this idea of their second contention on AF is that NAFTA made the Mexico recession better. So like, you know, they lifted Mexico out of their peso recession in 1994. And they had three separate links here, right? So the first link was that NAFTA meant increased imports, right? And within each of these links, they had more links to connect to the final impact, right? So the first link is that we increase exports with NAFTA. So the internal link in this, which basically means the link inside the link, right? Is that because of NAFTA, exports in Mexico increased by 4 times. And it would have like been a lot lower if there wasn't NAFTA, right? And the internal link here is that because exports increased, you know, Mexico was able to come out of this recession faster. Their second link was investor confidence, right? So basically, like everyone's like, crap, like Mexico's in a recession. Why would I invest in them? But because Mexico had NAFTA, you know, these investors were like, okay, well, you know, we can trust America is there buying, you know, Mexican exports. So we'll continue to invest in Mexico, which, you know, helped Mexico come out of the recession. And then their third link was a US bailout. So basically the US gave like Mexico a bunch of money. And they said the reason why this happened was because of NAFTA, right? Like the US doesn't even care about Mexico, but because they had NAFTA and they were in a trade agreement with Mexico, they didn't want Mexico to go in a recession because that could have negatively impacted the US, right? So they're like, okay, we'll give Mexico money because we want to save ourselves, right? And then overall the impact, right? For all of these three links, each of these are separate links into impact, which means if you take any one of these, so let's say they went for the first link, right? Increase exports. They could have just went like increase exports from NAFTA prevented the recession. They don't have to win all three of these exports, investor confidence, and US bailout. Just one of them is enough to give them full access to their impact, right? So that's the way that hopefully you're going to try to write your case. Is when you write your case, you want to have links that are separate from each other, that if you just, you know, win one of the links, you can win your entire impact, right? The overall link was a Mexican, you know, recession would have pushed millions into poverty and millions more because it would have led to like a global recession, which is bad for everyone. So that's what I would say you're looking for in a case. Now, moving on to rebuttal, right? If we look at the next rebuttal to this, overall, I would say it's a very strong rebuttal, right? They covered the entire flow. They responded to AF's case and also, yeah. So if we look, you know, obviously they spent less time on the first contention than the second contention, but I would say that's a pretty good strategic choice because when you're deciding which contentions you want to refute, usually go for the one that you think they're probably going to go for, right? And what do we mean by go for? Like we talked about in summary and final focus, how you have to collapse, because you can't like repeat your entire case again in a 3-minute summary, right? You just don't have that kind of time. So you're going to have to choose one of the contentions and probably one of the links. So what Neg did was a strategic choice, because, the first contention of AF was pretty like bad. Like I would say they probably wouldn't go for it, right? Like, what is the end impact of like human rights? Like we're not really sure what China would have or would have not done. The link there is kind of more sketchy. So overall, they obviously spent less time on that. So Neg spent a lot more time on contention 2. And basically what Neg here did was they attacked the uniqueness, right? So if we look back to this, right, the way that you build a contention is uniqueness, link, impact, warrant, and then impact, right? So uniqueness is basically this only happens in my world, right? So the first response on exports was this Harvard 16 card that they kept saying throughout the entire round, right? They're like, okay, with or without NAFTA, Mexico would have had a lot of trade because a lot of other people were trading with Mexico other than just the U.S., right? Like we don't really need NAFTA at all. So through that, they were attacking the uniqueness, right? And we called that a trying to find it, a non-unique, right? So you can non-unique in many different places. They just non-unique on like the impact level, right? So sure, NAFTA maybe like increase exports, but we don't necessarily need NAFTA because they could have like had exports to other countries. So they kind of non-unique like, they kind of non-unique that first, link in. And then looking at their responses to the second contention, right? They talked about how like investor confidence didn't matter. So again, there was another non-unique, lots of non-uniques, right? So they said, actually it was more like a turn. I would call this one a turn. So a link turn. So more like an impact turn actually. But anyways, it's just a turn on their case, right? Because they were like, oh, NAFTA was so... Actually, not a turn. Maybe just a non-unique. Yeah, so basically they said like, oh, Mexico didn't even need any FDI until NAFTA came along and like ruined their economy. And that's when they started getting reliant on, foreign direct investment or FDI. And then they non-unique a second time. So like, even if you don't believe that like Mexico didn't need FDI, like let's say they were to need FDI, Mexico still was like doing really great without without America and NAFTA. So investor confidence was really high. So that's why you would see that like with or without NAFTA, they would have gotten enough foreign funds to climb out of the recession. And then at the end, they did do an impact turn. Did I even put one here? So an impact turn is basically turning the impact, right? So they're like, oh yeah, NAFTA increased FDI, right? So you can turn the impact, saying that's not a good thing, that's a bad thing. And what Neg basically did was an impact turn, saying that, oh, when like NAFTA increased FDI, the specific kind of FDI was FPI, which is foreign portfolio investment, which is more like investment in stocks and stuff instead of investment in the companies, like directly giving them money so they can develop in these domestic industries. Instead, it made Mexico a lot more volatile, which made the recession obviously worse, right? So they impact turned that and saying that NAFTA overall had a bad impact on FDI. Okay, and then on the third part about a U.S. bailout, right? The first response was, again, a non-unique. And it was a U.S. would have prevented the global crisis anyways, even if there wasn't NAFTA. And the reasoning for this was behind it was like a Mexico recession would have led to a global recession. And obviously, the U.S. doesn't want a global recession. So with or without NAFTA, they would have given Mexico this money. And then the second response was also a non-unique. It's kind of more like all cause kind of non-unique. So they were saying like the bailout happened because we hate immigrants, not because we care about Mexico or we care about NAFTA or we care about a global recession. It's because when, countries near our borders, they become poor, those poor people want to escape poverty in their own countries, and they're looking for opportunities in places like America, right? And people like Bill Clinton hated immigrants, so they wanted to give Mexico money and be like, okay, now that we helped you, keep your immigrants out of here, right? So they gave like another reason for the bailout, so the bailout would have happened anyways. And then the third was really a link turn, kind of like how would I describe this? It's basically a turn on their entire second contention, saying that NAFTA is the cause of the recession. So without NAFTA ever existing, this recession would even have happened because NAFTA devalued the Mexican peso, which was what caused this peso recession, right? So basically, overall, it's just a turn on their case, saying that like without NAFTA, it would have been a lot better because none of the impacts would have ever happened. All right, so now let's talk about AF summary, right? I would say AF summary was like really strong, right? Every time you heard AF come second, I think they really brought the vote back and they made the round a lot clearer because Neg was like, talking about a lot of different things, but AF kind of solidified their point. So if we look at the AF summary, right? So what AF eventually gone for was their third link on their second contention into their impact, and then they kind of responded on Neg's contention. So basically how they went for their third link about U.S. bailout for Mexico, right? And they really didn't respond to Neg's first and second responses to NAFTA, So how, they said, oh, bailout would have happened because we hate immigrants, or bailout would have happened because of they wanted to prevent a global recession, right? And the problem with that was because Neg didn't extend it in their summary or in final focus. So, AF really didn't have to respond to it, and Neg kind of let AF get away with that. But so AF just said, oh yeah, the U.S. bailout happened because NAFTA was there, so that's the only reason why the U.S. would bail out Mexico, and because of that, we prevented a doubling in poverty like Argentina did, and instead we, stopped this Mexican recession from pushing lots of people into poverty, and we also stopped it from going global, right? And you heard some weighing at the bottom, which is on scope, right? We talked about weighing how, in summary, you do want to do weighing because you want to make sure that your judge knows whose argument to prefer, right? And they went for scope weighing. So magnitude, under magnitude is scope, right? So it's basically how many people do you affect, right? It's basically like how wide of an area do you affect. Like they only affect Mexico, but we're impacting people across the entire globe because it would have turned into a global recession, right? So that's where you heard a little bit of weighing. And then what AF said on Neg, right? They just said that like NAFTA had slow regulation, and they kind of like made it clear to the judges that like really the only thing that Neg talks about, the only example they give you about NAFTA being really bad for the economy is the agricultural part, right? So, but they're like, okay, but their evidence for the agriculture was really bad because it was talking about something else and not NAFTA. And NAFTA also had specific provisions to make sure there's like slow, liberalization of tariffs on the agricultural industry. And they're like, okay, it's all Mexico's fault. Like America was doing great. So they really like clarified that idea there. And that's kind of what you want to do in summary, right? So you want to make sure to really extend your own case and defend it. And then you want to maybe extend some defense on your opponent's case. And then in final focus, what AF did a really good job was was, really concentrating down on their sole point of the round, right? How, this bailout was really the thing that mattered overall, and how Neg's case doesn't matter because they talked about how NAFTA was the only one who was going to bail out this Mexico recession, and without NAFTA, it would have been really bad. And they pointed out how like Neg really has no impacts, right? It's kind of hard for us to quantify what would have happened in Neg's world because the only example they gave us was agriculture. But obviously their cards weren't very good for that, and Neg really didn't respond, didn't extend their own impact. Neg just said like, at the bottom of the Neg case, there's this card that says 60 million people would have been lifted out of poverty if there wasn't NAFTA, right? But they didn't extend that impact in summary, and they didn't like mention it at all in the final focus either. So it was kind of hard for the judges to, maybe vote for Neg's impact on that. So when you are, in your final round, you want to make sure that in final focus, you want to make sure that not only do you extend the link of your argument and like the general idea, right? Like, oh, US bailout only happened because of NAFTA, and that stopped the global recession. You want to make sure you say the specific impact, especially when you have like a really good number, like 60 million. That's a lot of people out of poverty, right? If he had just maybe said that number, it would have been a lot more convincing to the judges that they should be winning that round, right? Like that, we give you this exact number, judge, for how many people would have been lifted out of poverty without NAFTA. It's 60 million people without NAFTA, right? And it would have made overall a very more convincing case for the Neg. So now that you like watch the round, does it like help you understand how like everything we've talked about applies in a round?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did get a topic breakdown from Hannah, I think, on our current topic, the no first use policy, right?
What was that? Like,
so the resolution for the December topic. Do you remember?
I don't think I really got that part.
Did you like not understand what Hannah was explaining?
Was it the thing about nuclear thing?
Yeah, it's the nuclear thing.
I didn't really get that thing.
You didn't get it? Okay, so how about this? I'll try to find that. File and maybe we can talk about it. That is so weird. Okay, I found it. So let me just share my screen and we'll go over it really quickly because I think you've already heard it. I'll just like explain it maybe a little bit better. So the resolution is the United States should adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use. And basically, how we have like nuclear bombs, right? Like we bombed Japan during World War II. The United States has nuclear bombs, Russia has nuclear bombs, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, France, Britain, they all have nuclear bombs. And obviously nuclear bombs are really dangerous for a lot of reasons because, they can kill a lot of people. So what this resolution is talking about is that the US should adopt a declaratory nuclear policy of no first use. And what no first use means is basically the US can't be the first to bomb someone else. So basically the only time that the US would use a nuclear bomb is when someone else bombs us first, right? So if someone were to nuke us, we would use our nuclear bomb to nuke them back. And basically, right now, the US has a first use policy, which basically means like, even if you don't nuke us, we might just nuke you. And the point of doing that, we hoped, was to deter or basically like prevent our enemies from attacking us, because like they know that like if they try to attack us, we just nuke them to death first before they could do anything. So that's why we do have a first use policy instead of a no first use policy, right? And then something to note about the resolution is it's declaratory, which means it's just like I would tell everyone in the world that I have a no first use policy, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm gonna do anything about it, right? Like even if I tell you, like for example, if I told you, hey, if you win at this tournament, I'll give you $100. Like I just tell you that, right? Like I'm not signing a contract. How can you make sure that I'm actually gonna do that? You don't, right? So it's only declaratory. So the AF ideas is that right now there's a lot of miscalculation, right? Because people are like, okay, what if the US like nukes me? I should like nuke them first, right? Or like people are like, you know, the US has nukes and they could just nuke me, so I'm gonna build my own nukes in order to stop the US, you know, so in order to prevent the US from nuking me and I have like nothing, right? Because like if I have nukes and you have nukes, we both don't want to like nuke each other because we both don't want to die, right? For example, if I had a gun and you didn't have a gun and I just like shot you, you just die, right? So obviously you'd want a gun for yourself, and now that I know you have a gun, I choose not to shoot you because I don't want to die myself, right? So that's what we call mutually assured destruction. So that's why a lot of states have been building their own, not states, a lot of other countries have been building their own nukes because they don't want the US to nuke them, right? And the idea of a non-first use policy would is preventing nuclear proliferation is that, you know, once we tell them, I'm not going to nuke you first, they won't like feel a need as much to build their own nukes, right? If I tell you I'm not going to shoot you with my gun, I mean, obviously you could choose whether to not to believe it, but if you do believe it, you know, you might not feel like you do need to go buy a gun yourself because it's a pretty long process. Same idea with these nukes, right? And then, you know, anyone can, like, the president barely has to do anything to send a nuke right now. Like the president can just be like, I want to send a nuke. What do you think? What do you think? I don't care what you think. I'm going to send the nuke. And they send the nuke, right? So there's really very little control over who can send a nuke, right? And like, you know, if, see, like, right, it says right here, it only takes 15 minutes from order to launch, right? So that's very quick from a nuclear bomb that could kill millions of people, right? So you, like, we probably don't want to have that kind of power to a president unless someone else bombs us first, right? So I would say that's why a no first use policy is good. And then miscalc is like, you know, right now North Korea and US tensions are really high, but maybe if we tell them like, I won't just nuke you out of nowhere, they won't feel the need to nuke us first. What else? Escalation, right? So okay, so basically, yeah, that's the idea for AF, that like by adopting a no first use policy, people would still be scared of nuking us because we can still nuke them back. It's just people wouldn't be trying to make their own nukes and trying to nuke us first because they know we won't nuke them first. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. And then on neg, the general idea is that what's the point of a declaratory no first use? Like if I tell you I'm not going to shoot you, you're probably not going to believe me, right? So obviously it's going to have a very small impact on my decision calculus. But let's say I do believe it, right? Like American allies are very scared because they don't have their own nukes, because America's like, hey, I'm your like best buddy, right? I'm going to protect you. But once the US is like I'm not going to use nukes first on anyone else, they're like, okay, well, I don't have my own nukes. How am I going to know that some other country won't nuke me first? And America like obviously you want to prevent being nuked yourself, right? Like if America has first use, they can like nuke the country before they nuke, you know, let's say like North Korea and South Korea. North Korea has a bunch of nukes. South Korea has no nukes, but they have the US protection, right? So if North Korea decided to like, you know, nuke South Korea, America would just send a nuke to like intercept the nuke and they'd like explode in the air and like nobody in South Korea would die, right? But if the US were like, okay, I'm not going to use nukes first, then South Korea would have no protection against North Korea, right? Like North Korea could just bomb South Korea and maybe afterwards America would bomb North Korea. But really the point of a nuke is to prevent any nukes from being sent at all, right? I don't want to have to use a nuke and you shouldn't be using nukes on me as well, right? So South Korea will begin to like suspect the US, like, oh, the US is like not going to protect me anymore, so I might as well build my own nukes. So then South Korea is going to start building nukes, and it's going to create like a lot of tensions between North and South Korea, because obviously then North Korea will be very scared of South Korea. They'll be like, what if South Korea just decides to nuke me first? Well, I might as well nuke South Korea first, right? So that's where you see Allied Prolife, which just basically means our allies are going to start building nukes as well now that they've lost the US, you know, nuclear assurance. So that's the reason why it's bad. And I would say another reason why it's bad is like it can like when you know, right now a no first use policy means I won't use nukes on anyone unless they use nukes on me, right? But what if they were to use like a biological chemical warfare weapon, like they released like, you know, like Corona or something like a chemical weapon on all of the United States and they killed like millions of people, right? That would, you know, that's obviously killing the same amount of people as a nuclear bomb would. But since we said we're not gonna like use no first use, they can be like, haha, you said that you wouldn't use nukes, so I'm just gonna like use a chemical bomb on you, right? And you can't respond to that with a nuke. So then we can't deter, or we can't like prevent, you know, our enemies from trying to do that. And also conventional warfare is basically warfare without nukes, basically, like you know, people on the ground in the troops shooting other people across the trench, right? That's conventional warfare. Basically just means like boots on the ground, people in real life, not like cyber attacks or like, you know, nuclear bombs or air missiles. And conventional warfare is very costly, but usually America can try to prevent conventional warfare by saying, hey, if you even like try conventional warfare, we're just nuke you at once. Like we're not even gonna like go to war with you. We're just gonna nuke you and we're gonna kill all of you, and there's not gonna be a war because you're just gonna like die, right? But now instead, if we say we're not gonna use nukes unless you use nukes, then we actually have to send like real people on the ground and like send people over there and like start wars. And obviously that's a lot more inefficient than just like nuking them or preventing the war from happening in the first place because they're so scared of us nuking them, right? So that's some arguments for the neg that you can make. Do you have any questions?
No.
No? Okay, well, that's great. So do you understand everything that just happened? So what I want you to do for next week is write one contention or like just one paragraph, one argument on the app or the neg side. It doesn't matter about this topic. Okay, so you can see I'm writing one right now. This contention is on miscalculation. And what you want to do is first you want to say, you want to establish some context, you know, for your lay judges. I like right here, I say like, oh, nuclear bombs are so dangerous. And then you want to establish your uniqueness, right? So I say tensions are super high and miscalculation is rampant because we don't have a non-first use policy. But once we get one, we would prevent miscalculation. And then let's just go for a specific link, right? So I would say link. The first, decrease miscalculation by eliminating preemptive strikes, which basically means we can't shoot them first, right? And then my link here is that NFU basically means that you can't use it first. thus, Panda 18 concludes that NFU would alleviate fears and reduce risk of Russian and Chinese like nuclear miscalculation, because now that they know we're not going to nuke them first, there's no reason for them to do it first either. And then the impact would be like thousands of lives. I haven't written it yet, but you know, really simple. Just maybe read 2 or 3 articles on it, and then you can probably find a link and an impact. Does that make sense?
So do I have to do that?
Yes. So just really short, like it's like you can make your whole entire contention in 4 sentences. There's the uniqueness, the link, and then the impact. Okay, 3 sentences, even easier. So either app or neg, it doesn't matter, but please do try to write a contention before you come to class next week. All right, well.